At 1:45 a.m., Emily Ryerson boards one of the last boats to be launched with her 2 daughters and 1 son. Her husband stays behind. Titanic's designer, Thomas Andrews, is last seen looking lost in a trance in the first-class smoking room. As Titanic's stern tilts higher, the Lindells and August Wennerstrom slide into the water. Relieved of his duty, Second Officer Lightoller also takes his chances in the sea. Immediately, he is sucked into a ventilation shaft.
Although I struggled and kicked for all I was worth, it was impossible to get away, every instant expecting myself shot down into the bowels of the ship. I was still struggling and fighting when suddenly a terrific blast of hot air came up the shaft and blew me right away up to the surface.
From the surface, Lightoller witnesses the end of RMS Titanic.
The bow of the ship was now rapidly going down, and the stern was rising higher and higher out of the water, piling the people into helpless heaps around the steep decks, and by the score into the icy water. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
As she swung up, her lights, which had shone without a flicker all night, went out suddenly, came on again for a single flash, then went out altogether. Second-class passenger, Lawrence Beasley.
The stern stood for several minutes, black against the stars. And then the boat plunged out. Then began the cries for help, which seemed to go on forever. First-class passenger, Mrs. Emily Ryerson.
As Titanic plummets to the ocean floor, the most beautiful liner the world ever saw shatters into pieces. On the surface, the human drama continues. Charles Lightoller manages to climb atop an overturned lifeboat. Some 13 men struggle here to keep their balance, to prevent slipping into the icy water. Wireless operators Bride and Phillips are among these men. Phillips will die of exposure before morning. The Lindells manage to find a lifeboat, but the boat overturns, sending them helplessly back into the sea.
For how long a time I was away from the boat, I don't know. When I came back to the boat, it was filled with water. My friend, Edvard Lindell, had also got aboard. I saw Mrs. Lindell in the water and clasped her hand. I didn't have the strength to pull her aboard. Mr. Lindell looked straight ahead, never made a move or said a word. I realized that he'd frozen to death. After a half hour, I lost my grip and saw Mrs. Lindell disappear into the sea. Third-class passenger, August Wennerstrom.
More than 1,500 men, women, and children perish this night. Relics of their lives are strewn along the ocean floor. Artifacts like these provide the last clues to their stories. Among broken plates and debris, Haas makes a discovery. He finds and retrieves a device called a telegraph that was used to signal the engines.
Your emotional attachment to a particular object eventually evolves into a great deal of anxiousness about its future. And when you see the artifacts being brought up, and in particular when you see them being conserved, that anxiousness is replaced by a great deal of happiness that you've preserved them for the future.
After a day of exploration, Nautil returns to the surface with precious cargo. On the fantail of Nadir, the newly discovered artifact is shared with the crew.
Well, history's progressed another notch there, Charles.
I'm really quite overwhelmed by that. It's all right.
In a warehouse in Hamburg, Germany, people line up to visit an extraordinary exhibit of Titanic artifacts. Historians Charles Haas and Jack Eaton and expedition leader George Tulloch take in the emotional display. They have come to see fragments of history, some of which they have helped to rescue from certain oblivion. Certain objects here played a critical role during Titanic's final hours. The giant wrenches used by the men in the boiler room remind us of those who struggled to keep Titanic afloat. Men like Frederick Barrett. Barrett survived the disaster and continued to work most of his life out at sea. One of Titanic's brass bells, a symbol of her elite officers, including Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Lightoller was the only senior officer to survive Titanic. He retired unceremoniously. During World War II, he used his yacht in daring missions to aid the British war effort. This claim check, number 208, belonged to Lawrence Beasley, and it was retrieved from the ocean bottom. Beasley lived to be 89 and write one of the most significant accounts of the Titanic tragedy. Women's jewelry reminds us that many of Titanic's survivors were widowed that night. When Mrs. Ryerson arrived in New York, she would bury her son, who was killed in a car crash, and mourn her lost husband. Mrs. Ryerson died at the age of 76. Masabumi Hosono lived reclusively and rarely spoke of Titanic. His rare written account has now become a part of history. Hosono lived to be 69 and died in Japan. August Wennerstrom survived Titanic. He spent most of his life in America and died in Culver, Indiana. This is the wedding band.